the biggest losers so far between the US and China tension is actually Europe. And Europe should actually be the big winners. Europe should be looking to do deals with the United States and do deals with China and extract the best trade opportunities with both countries. But inexplicably, the Europeans have vassalized themselves to the United States. And it really just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. When you look at it, in 2008, Europe's economy was actually larger than America's. Now, Europe's economy is about 40–50% smaller than America's. And it's only going to continue to get worse as the Europeans don't buy cheap energy from Russia and rely on American LNG gas, which America is selling to Europe for 4 times the price. And importantly, instead of trying to forge strong trade relations with China, which would be a great way for Germany to export its way out of its economic malaise, which would be a great way for London and the UK to solidify its position as a finance center by getting Chinese companies to IPO there. Instead of doing all of this, European leaders are continuing to fearmonger about China's rise and are continuing to issue xenophobic statements, whether it be about China building a larger embassy in London, which a lot of British are saying is going to be used to spy on the Brits, whether it be Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas in Brussels saying that China is a threat to the European way of life, or even worse, when you see Mark Rutte, who is the former prime minister of the Netherlands and is now the Secretary General of NATO, says that it's highly likely that China is going to push Russia to invade NATO countries. So you have all this fear-mongering and xenophobia about China's rise is really hurting Europe's ability to extract the best trade deals and the best investment for their people. And they need it, because the average European has dropped about 40% in their quality of life over the last 15 to 20 years, which can largely be attributed to bad policy and decision-making in Europe. So let's take a closer example. The Dutch essentially took Nexperia, which is a semiconductor company that's affiliated with the Chinese. And we still don't know what the complete story is. They say that it might have been because the CEO of the company, a Chinese person, was trying to buy and spend more money than he should have from some of his other companies, thus hurting Nexperia in the Netherlands. But it's clear, to me anyway, that whether that was an issue or not, the way the Dutch went about seizing control of Nexperia was a mistake. They didn't talk with the Chinese authorities. Second, they banned a Chinese to be CEO of the company. I'm not sure why you would do that unless you were racist. And then third, they also said that they were concerned about Chinese, the subsidiary company or affiliate companies, getting the technology from Nexperia in the Netherlands and transferring it back to China. But the reality is this was a Chinese company that bought fairly Nexperia in the Dutch and are transferring technology. So on the one hand, you have Europeans saying that China only steals IP and technology from the Europeans. But this is an example of Chinese spending billions of dollars investing in Europe to buy IP, create jobs, and they still can't get access to their technology on the grounds of national security threats. So to me, this is just another bad action by the Dutch and is representative of a lot of countries in the EU that are fear-mongering about China's rise. Frankly, over the next decade, to me, the best countries that are going to be strong economically and powerful will be the United States, if it can handle the polarization and get through the next 3 years with President Trump. China, if it doesn't implode politically and ensures that there's steady economy and steady leadership transitions. And then India. I think Europe is going to be the big loser of all the major powers over the next decade because they're not They're vassalizing themselves to the United States, not benefiting from their relationship with the US, not forging strong relations with China, and they're basically a stagnant country, or a stagnant region, I should say. A lot of the countries there, they only work 35 hours a week. They take months and months off on vacation. It's almost impossible to fire a low-performing employee. They're really stifling innovation in Europe. So Europe is becoming what a lot of Europeans recognize as an open-air museum. But I'll go one step farther. It's becoming a crime-infested open-air museum, because the crime in Europe is getting out of control to the point that Chinese tourists don't want to visit Europe anymore. They would rather go to safe regions like Malaysia, like Japan, or to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because those countries are safe to visit and they're welcoming Chinese tourists. So why hasn't Europe taken a more pragmatic approach to working with China and forging strong relations? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. They might be scared of China's rise, and China has a different culture and a different value system in some ways, even though I think at the end of the day, Chinese and Europeans are very similar. They want to have a better life for their families. They want to make money. They want to be able to pay for education and medical care for their family members. So I think there's more similarities than differences. If I were advising the Europeans, I would say, if you were scared of China's economic strength, work with it. Don't ban them. Don't fearmonger about them. Tell the Chinese, if you want to invest in the auto sector in Europe, you need to set up a joint venture with a German company or a French company. I think that's fair. After all, that's what the Chinese did to BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen in the 1990s. They forced these great German automakers to set up joint ventures with Chinese companies. So I think Chinese companies and China's government would be okay, not with forced technology transfer, but with forced joint ventures, working together, coming up with a win-win situation for both European companies and Chinese companies. I think that's totally fair. The only reason why I can think that a lot of European leaders don't want to do this really derives from two things. The first is self-interest, and the second is bigotry or racism. I think you see a lot of European leaders, once they lose their position, they go into the for-profit business sector, usually in the United States. You see Rishi Sunak, who is a big China hawk, is now helping out Goldman Sachs, an investment bank. You saw that Tony Blair, after he was prime minister of the UK, he went on the international board of JP Morgan, another investment bank. And you see the former deputy prime minister of the UK, Nick Clegg, worked for Facebook or Meta until just recently. So I think there's a lot of individual self-interest from European politicians about making money by working closer with the United States, because afterwards they'll get a plum job with an investment bank, or they might be able to work for a company, say in the weapons industry, that benefits from close ties between Europe and the United States. And then second, frankly, there's a lot of bigotry and racism. Now, not everything in this world is about racism. Okay, you see a lot of people say, I didn't get this job, or I didn't get this because of racism. That's not always true. But at the end of the day, racism does cause a lot of issues in world affairs. It's very clear to me that the United States and Western Europe, the former colonial and imperial countries, are not okay with having yellow-skinned people, black-skinned people, and brown-skinned people move and grow up. You see a lot of tension right now between Muslims and people in France, or Muslims and people of the United States, Muslims and people of the UK. And I think there's a lot of dislike for Chinese as well from a racist standpoint. And then perhaps the biggest issue is bigotry. Now, bigotry towards communism is what I mean. So it's a different intellectual view or ideological view of government systems. I think many in the West have started to adopt their belief in liberal democracies, almost as if it's like a religion, where they say liberal democracies are the only one true political system. And any other political system, whether it be a monarchy or whether it be a communist-like nation in China, they automatically denigrate and think it's evil. Now, I've been in China for 28 years. I have met many, many American political leaders, and a lot of them say that China's political system, the CPC, by definition is evil and needs to be replaced. I've met with many senior leaders in China, Politburo members, governors. I have never heard one Chinese official say that America's political system or a liberal democracy is evil and needs to be replaced with a communist system. Typically, what I hear from the Chinese is, our system works for us, America's system works for America, leave me alone, let me be. But there's a Christian missionary-like zeal in Western world that is trying to force liberal democracies onto other countries. And I think finally, when it comes to communism, I think a lot of Europeans and Americans hate communism, even though they don't know what it is. I grew up in New Hampshire in the United States, where the license plates say live free or die. Now, that was actually a license plate that came up during the Red Scare in the 1950s in the United States, where my home state said, live free or die against the red commies from the Soviet Union. And so I think a lot of people in the West make a mistake in thinking that Chinese communism is the same as Soviet Union communism, and they hate what they don't know. There's actually a lot more flexibility in China than under the Soviet era communism. So for instance, here, obviously you have a very bustling, burgeoning private sector. You have individual ownership. It's capitalist in many ways. You also have some sense of religion. You don't have the same freedom of religion in China that you have in the United States or Europe. You know, there are many Christians, there are millions of them here. There's millions of Buddhists in Tibet. And I think the government does a good job at letting people adhere to their faith, as long as the people in charge of the faith, the bishops and the monks, at the end of the day, look to the CPC or the Communist Party of China as the final powers. While in the United States and in Europe, if you're Catholic, you're going to look at the Pope as being more important in many ways than the prime minister or president of your own country. China doesn't want to do that because they suffered during the 1840s and 1850s, during the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion, where tens of millions of people died because somebody thought he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. So they're scared about organized religion that they can't control. And I think, just for me, philosophically, I think it's good to have religion and semi-freedom of religion, but I also think it's good to have religion that's underneath the umbrella of the government, so that you ensure people have their faith, but you don't allow too much anger come from it. I mean, you look at what's happening in Gaza and Israel right now because of religion. And I think in Europe, we're seeing that same hatred towards China because of religion and a misunderstanding of what China is. The best thing for Europe to do right now would be to forge strong relations with China and the United States and play off both of each other in order to benefit from their economic gains. For instance, for 5 years, until earlier this year, China didn't buy a single Boeing airplane. This is a great opportunity for Airbus. But because Macron and the French have not always been that respectful of China, China has also focused on building up Comac, or its own homegrown airliner. This could have been huge profits for France and for Europe, but the Europeans vassalized themselves to the Americans and fear-mongered about China's rise, unfortunately.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。 提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。